In the spring of 2019, a faded daguerreotype discovered in a Tennessee estate auction changed everything historians thought they knew about plantation marriages. The photograph showed a young girl in white standing beside a much older man in a chapel, her eyes downcast, her hands folded. On the back, written in careful script, "Chapel wedding, April 1853. Sarah, age 14. What made archivists' blood run cold was the second line, property of Reverend Blackwell. This wasn't a typical marriage ceremony. This was documentation of something far darker, a systematic program hidden behind religious ceremony, orchestrated by the very man meant to provide spiritual guidance. For over 160 years, the truth remained buried in chapel records, coded ledgers, and the silence of descendants who carried shame that wasn't theirs to bear. What the photograph revealed was just the beginning. The Reverend Josiah Blackwell wasn't just a preacher. He was the architect of a breeding program disguised as Christian matrimony, and his chapel became the site where young enslaved girls were legally bound to produce children for their masters. The discovery of this single photograph opened a door to hundreds of similar cases, all conducted under the cover of religious ceremony, all documented in journals that survived only because no one thought to destroy them. This is the story of what was hiding behind those chapel doors. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The photograph that wouldn't stay buried. The daguerreotype appeared unremarkable at first. Just another artifact from the antebellum South, destined for a collector's archive or a museum storage room. But when Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a historian specializing in plantation documentation, examined the image more carefully in late 2019, she noticed details that didn't align with typical period photographs. The girl's dress, while white, bore none of the elaborate decoration common to weddings of free women. Her expression held no joy, no anticipation, only a hollow resignation that seemed to stare through the camera and across the centuries. The man beside her appeared to be in his 40s, well-dressed, with the stern bearing of someone accustomed to authority. But it was the inscription on the back that stopped Morrison cold. Property of Reverend Blackwell wasn't language used for brides. It was language used for livestock, for tools, for human beings denied their humanity. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a wedding photograph. It was a transaction record disguised as a matrimonial portrait. Morrison spent weeks trying to trace the photograph's origins, following the auction records back through 3 estate sales until she identified the original source. The Blackwell family plantation in rural Tennessee, a property that had operated one of the largest cotton operations in the region during the 1850s. The plantation had been dismantled after the Civil War, the main house burned during Reconstruction, and the family scattered. But the chapel, a small wooden structure that had served as the spiritual center of the plantation, had somehow survived, converted first into a storage building, then abandoned entirely. When Morrison visited the site in early 2020, she found the chapel still standing, though barely. The roof had partially collapsed, and decades of weather had warped the wooden walls. But inside, in a sealed wooden trunk that had been forgotten beneath debris, she discovered something extraordinary: Reverend Blackwell's personal journals, spanning from 1847 to 1862. The journals were meticulous, detailed, and absolutely damning. They documented not one wedding, but hundreds, ceremonies that bound young, enslaved girls to men selected by plantation owners specifically to produce children who would themselves become property. The journals revealed that Blackwell had performed over 300 such ceremonies across multiple plantations in the region. He had developed a system, a methodology that disguised forced reproduction as Christian marriage. Girls as young as 12 were brought to the chapel, dressed in white clothing provided by their owners, and married in ceremonies that gave a veneer of legitimacy to what was happening. The journal entries were clinical, noting names, ages, and the plantation owners who had commissioned each ceremony. Blackwell recorded fees for his services, $5 per ceremony, plus additional payments for what he called consultations about optimal pairings. What made the discovery even more disturbing was Blackwell's own commentary in the margins of his journals. He expressed no moral conflict about what he was doing. Instead, he wrote proudly of his role in what he called the improvement of the Negro stock and his contribution to the economic prosperity of Christian planters. He saw himself not as complicit in abuse, but as a facilitator of divine order, a man helping to fulfill what he believed was the natural hierarchy ordained by God. The photograph of Sarah wasn't unique. Blackwell had commissioned similar daguerreotypes for wealthy plantation owners, creating what amounted to breeding records disguised as wedding portraits. The images served a dual purpose. They provided documentation of the transaction for the plantation owner's records, and they created an illusion of legitimacy that could be displayed if questions were ever raised. It was systematic, calculated, and entirely legal under the laws of the time. Morrison's discovery sparked immediate controversy when she published her findings in 2021. Some historians questioned the authenticity of the journals, unable to reconcile the methodical documentation of such systematic abuse with their understanding of antebellum religious institutions. Others argued that Morrison was projecting modern sensibilities onto historical practices. But the evidence was irrefutable. The journals corroborated property records, birth records, and oral histories that had been dismissed for decades as exaggeration or folklore. Descendants of families who had been enslaved on plantations served by Blackwell began coming forward with stories that had been passed down through generations. Stories of great-great-grandmothers who had been children when they were forced into these ceremonies, stories of trauma that had never been officially acknowledged or recorded. The photograph of Sarah became a symbol of something larger, the systematic erasure of the full horror of slavery from historical memory, and the complicity of institutions that claimed moral authority while facilitating unimaginable cruelty. The discovery raised fundamental questions about historical documentation and institutional responsibility. How many other churches and religious leaders had participated in similar programs? How many photographs existed in private collections, their true meaning obscured by time and deliberate historical amnesia? And most importantly, how many descendants carried the genetic legacy of these forced unions without knowing the circumstances of their ancestors' suffering? The photograph of Sarah, that faded image from 1853, had opened a door that could never be closed. Behind it lay a vast network of complicity, documentation, and carefully maintained silence that had survived for over 160 years. The Reverend Blackwell's chapel had kept its secrets, but now those secrets were demanding to be heard. Chapter 2. The Preacher's Plantation Circuit. Reverend Josiah Blackwell arrived in Tennessee in 1845, fresh from a seminary in South Carolina, carrying letters of recommendation from prominent planters and a reputation for what they called practical theology. He was 32 years old, unmarried, and ambitious. Within 2 years, he had established himself not just as a preacher for white congregations, but as a specialist in what plantation owners delicately referred to as Negro management. His services extended far beyond Sunday sermons. He became a consultant and advisor, and eventually, the architect of a system that would affect hundreds of lives. The plantation economy of the 1840s and 1850s faced a significant challenge. The international slave trade had been officially banned in 1808, though illegal trafficking continued. Plantation owners who wanted to expand their operations needed a domestic source of enslaved labor, and the most cost-effective method was breeding. But there were complications. Enslaved people naturally resisted being reduced to breeding stock. Communities formed bonds, chose partners, created families according to their own customs and desires. Plantation owners needed a way to impose their will while maintaining an illusion of propriety. Blackwell offered a solution. He proposed creating a formal system of marriages that would give plantation owners legal and religious justification for controlling reproduction. By conducting ceremonies in a church setting, with Christian vows and official documentation, he could transform what was essentially forced breeding into something that appeared respectable. The marriages would have no legal standing. Enslaved people couldn't legally marry in most southern states, but they would create a paper trail that satisfied religious sensibilities and provided documentation for inheritance and property transfer. His first chapel was built on the Waverly Plantation in 1847, funded entirely by the plantation owner, Colonel Marcus Waverly. It was a simple wooden structure, whitewashed and modest, with a small bell tower and wooden pews. Waverly understood the value of what Blackwell was offering: religious legitimacy for a program that would dramatically increase the plantation's wealth. Within the first year, Blackwell performed 43 ceremonies at Waverly alone, each one binding a young enslaved girl to a man selected by the plantation owner based on perceived physical strength, health, or other desirable traits. The journals revealed how methodical the system became. Blackwell developed written criteria for what he called optimal unions. He consulted with plantation owners about genetic traits, physical characteristics, and temperament. Girls were evaluated like livestock, assessed for their potential to produce healthy children. The journals contained detailed notes about each bride, including age, health status, and family lineage. Some entries noted objections or resistance, but these were dismissed as emotional reactions that would subside once the marriages were consummated. Blackwell traveled a circuit of 7 plantations across 3 counties, spending several days at each location every month. He became so valued that plantation owners built chapels specifically to accommodate his services. Each chapel was virtually identical, simple, functional, designed to facilitate efficiency rather than inspiration. The ceremonies themselves were brief, often lasting less than 10 minutes. Multiple weddings would be conducted in sequence, sometimes as many as 5 or 6 in a single afternoon. The brides wore identical white dresses provided by the plantation, creating a uniformity that stripped away any individual identity. What made the system particularly insidious was how it exploited religious faith. Many of the enslaved people forced into these marriages had embraced Christianity, finding in it a source of hope and community. Blackwell manipulated this faith, using scripture to justify the program and condemning resistance as sinful. He preached that submission to one's master was submission to God, that the marriages he conducted were divinely ordained, and that producing children was a sacred duty. For people who had few sources of comfort in their brutal existence, this theological manipulation added another layer of psychological torment. The journals also documented Blackwell's financial success. By 1855, he was earning over $600 annually from wedding ceremonies alone, a substantial income at a time when an average worker might earn $300 per year. He charged additional fees for consultations, for written documentation, and for what he called marital counseling, sessions where he would instruct couples on their duties and responsibilities. The chapel program made him wealthy, and his wealth bought him influence in the community. But the journals also revealed something else. Blackwell was aware of the suffering his system caused. Several entries mentioned girls who had to be physically carried into the chapel, who wept throughout the ceremony, who begged to be released from the marriages. One entry from 1853, the same year as Sarah's photograph, described a bride who fainted during the ceremony. Blackwell's response was clinical. Revived with salts. Ceremony completed. Payment collected in full. He rationalized the suffering by categorizing the enslaved as less capable of sophisticated emotion. In his worldview, their resistance was merely animal instinct, their grief less profound than that of white people, their trauma insignificant compared to the economic benefits the system provided. It was a mindset that allowed him to perform these ceremonies year after year without apparent moral crisis, to document his role with pride rather than shame, to see himself as a pillar of the community rather than an architect of systematic abuse. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, Blackwell had performed over 300 ceremonies. Behind each ceremony was a story of stolen youth, coerced unions, and children born into bondage because their mothers had been given no choice. The preacher's circuit had carved a path of trauma across the Tennessee countryside, and the evidence of that trauma would remain hidden for more than 150 years. Chapter 3. The wedding day Sarah never forgot. April 14, 1853, began like any other morning on the Thornton plantation. Sarah woke before dawn in the cabin she shared with her mother and younger siblings, unaware that this would be the day her childhood ended. She was 14 years old, though her owner had recorded her age as 16 in his ledgers. a common practice designed to make such unions appear slightly less objectionable to outside observers. Sarah had been selected 3 weeks earlier, chosen from among the plantation's young girls for what Master Thornton called an advantageous pairing. The man selected for her was named Joshua, a field hand from a neighboring plantation who was nearly 30 years old. They had never spoken. Sarah had seen him perhaps twice in her life, brief glimpses when enslaved people from different plantations were allowed to gather for harvest celebrations or religious services. The decision had been made without her input, negotiated between Thornton and Joshua's owner as a business arrangement. Joshua's owner would receive half of any children born from the union, an investment in future property that made the arrangement financially beneficial for both plantation owners. Sarah's mother had tried to prepare her, speaking in whispers late at night when the other children were asleep. But what could be said? What words existed to prepare a 14-year-old girl for what was coming? Her mother had been through this herself, forced into a union at 15 that had produced Sarah and her siblings. The trauma of that experience had never left her, and now she was helpless to protect her daughter from the same fate. The only comfort she could offer was survival. Endure, persist, find whatever small moments of joy or resistance were possible within the horror. The preparations began at noon. 2 older enslaved women came to the cabin carrying the white dress Sarah would wear. It was plain cotton, worn before by other brides, washed and mended repeatedly until it was more patches than original fabric. They helped her into the dress, worked her hair into a simple braid, and offered what encouragement they could muster. But their eyes betrayed their own memories, their own wedding days conducted in the same chapel under the same circumstances. Sympathy without hope. That was all they could provide. The walk to the chapel felt endless. Sarah was escorted by Master Thornton himself, who maintained a jovial demeanor, chatting about the weather and the cotton crop as though they were going to a social event rather than a ceremony that would irrevocably alter her life. Other enslaved people stopped their work to watch the procession, their faces showing a mixture of pity and relief. Pity for Sarah, relief that it wasn't their daughter, their sister, themselves being marched toward the whitewashed building at the edge of the property. Inside the chapel, Reverend Blackwell waited with his Bible and ledger. He greeted Master Thornton warmly, discussing payment and logistics, while Sarah stood silently, her presence acknowledged only as the subject of the transaction. Joshua arrived minutes later, escorted by his owner. He looked uncomfortable in clothes that didn't quite fit, his hands calloused from field work, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met briefly, Sarah saw something she couldn't quite identify. Resignation, perhaps, or shame, or simply exhaustion. He was as trapped as she was, forced into this arrangement by circumstances neither could control. The ceremony was mercifully brief. Blackwell recited abbreviated vows, more focused on obedience and duty than love or partnership. He spoke of Christian submission, of the natural order ordained by God, of the responsibilities of producing children who would be strong workers. Sarah was instructed to repeat words she barely heard over the roaring in her ears. Her mouth moved, but her mind had retreated somewhere else, somewhere safe where this wasn't happening. Joshua's responses were equally mechanical, spoken in a voice that carried no conviction. When Blackwell pronounced them married, Master Thornton produced a bottle of whiskey to toast the union. The white men drank, while the subjects of the ceremony stood in silence. Then came the daguerreotype. Master Thornton had commissioned the photograph to commemorate what he considered a significant investment. Sarah and Joshua were positioned side by side, told to remain still for the long exposure. The resulting image captured everything: Sarah's dead eyes, Joshua's rigid posture, the chapel walls that had witnessed this scene repeated countless times. After the photograph, there was no celebration, no reception, no moment of transition or adjustment. Sarah was simply told to return to her cabin and prepare for that evening, when Joshua would arrive to consummate the marriage. Her mother would be sent to stay elsewhere for the night, giving them privacy, as though privacy meant anything in a world where every aspect of their lives was controlled and monitored. The wedding was complete, the documentation recorded, the transaction finalized. That night became a memory Sarah would carry for the rest of her life. She survived it, as she would survive the 9 children she bore over the next 15 years. But survival isn't the same as living, and the girl who had walked into the chapel that April morning never truly emerged. The woman who took her place learned to endure, to find small resistances to protect her children as much as circumstances allowed. She learned to carry trauma that had no outlet, no validation, no acknowledgement. Now, here's where I need you. Leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 4. The Breeding Ledgers and Hidden Records. When Dr. Morrison carefully removed the documents from the sealed trunk in Blackwell's abandoned chapel, she initially thought she had found only the preacher's journals. But beneath those leather-bound books lay something even more revealing. A complete set of breeding ledgers that documented the outcomes of the marriages Blackwell had performed. These ledgers weren't written in Blackwell's hand. They had been maintained by plantation owners and their overseers, but they referenced Blackwell's chapel weddings as the starting point for each entry. The ledgers transformed what might have been dismissed as religious ceremony into irrefutable evidence of systematic forced reproduction. The ledgers were organized by plantation, with each entry tracking a married couple over time. They recorded dates of births, the gender and health status of each child, and calculations of economic value. Some entries included notes about complications, about miscarriages or stillbirths, about mothers who died in childbirth. The language was clinical, devoid of emotion, treating human reproduction as nothing more than livestock management. One ledger from the Waverly plantation contained a section titled Return on Investment, calculating the financial value of children born through chapel marriages compared to the costs of maintaining the program. The calculations were horrifying in their detail. Plantation owners had determined that the chapel wedding system, despite requiring payments to Blackwell and some investment in maintaining the appearance of legitimacy, provided a net positive return within 5 years of each marriage. A bride like Sarah, married at 14, could potentially produce 8 to 10 children before age 35, children who would themselves become valuable property. The ledgers tracked these children through their early years, noting when they became old enough for field work or when they reached the age where they too could be married through Blackwell's chapel system. But the ledgers also revealed resistance that Blackwell's journals had largely omitted. Numerous entries noted women who refused to breed, who used herbal remedies passed down through generations to prevent pregnancy, who found ways to subvert the system despite constant monitoring. Some entries described women who were punished for this resistance, subjected to increased surveillance or separated from their communities. Other entries simply noted that certain marriages had failed to produce, with recommendations to arrange different pairings. The resistance documented in these ledgers represented an extraordinary act of courage. Women who prevented pregnancies knew they were risking severe punishment, yet they chose bodily autonomy over compliance. Some of this knowledge came from African traditions preserved through oral transmission, herbal practices that had survived the Middle Passage and continued to be shared among enslaved communities. Other methods were discovered through experimentation, shared in whispers, taught from mother to daughter as tools of survival and resistance. Morrison discovered that the ledgers had been hidden deliberately during Reconstruction. As Union forces advanced and slavery's end became inevitable, plantation owners who had participated in Blackwell's chapel program faced a dilemma. The ledgers were valuable records for insurance claims and estate planning, but they were also incriminating evidence of practices that even slavery's defenders might find difficult to justify. Some plantations destroyed their records entirely, burning ledgers and correspondence in bonfires that consumed decades of documentation. But others, hoping slavery might somehow be restored, or that the records might have future value, hid them instead. The Waverly ledgers had been sealed in the chapel trunk, along with Blackwell's journals in late 1864, just months before the Civil War ended. A note tucked among the documents, written by Colonel Waverly's son, explained the decision. These records document substantial investments and should not be destroyed, but they cannot be allowed to fall into Union hands. The chapel, being abandoned and unremarkable, should preserve them until circumstances allow for their recovery. Those circumstances never came. The Waverly family abandoned the plantation entirely after Reconstruction, and the chapel, along with its hidden archives, was forgotten. The ledgers also documented the expansion of Blackwell's program beyond his original circuit. By the late 1850s, other preachers had begun adopting his methodology, creating similar chapel wedding systems across the Deep South. The documents included correspondence between Blackwell and other ministers, sharing advice about optimal ceremonies, discussing pricing structures, and congratulating each other on their contributions to plantation prosperity. What had begun as one man's innovation had evolved into a network, a coordinated system that affected thousands of lives. One particularly disturbing aspect of the ledgers was how they tracked the intergenerational impact of the chapel marriages. Children born from these unions were themselves prime candidates for the program when they reached adolescence. The ledgers contained genealogical charts showing family trees shaped entirely by forced reproduction, tracking genetic lines across multiple generations. Some plantation owners had developed long-term breeding strategies, planning marriages decades in advance based on desired traits. It was eugenics dressed in Christian ceremony, systematic manipulation of human reproduction to maximize economic benefit. The discovery of these ledgers fundamentally changed historical understanding of slavery's mechanisms. Historians had long known that enslaved people were forced into sexual relationships, but the extent of systematic organization documented in these records was shocking. This wasn't opportunistic abuse by individual owners. It was a coordinated program involving religious institutions, legal frameworks, and careful documentation. The chapel weddings gave the system a veneer of legitimacy that made it easier for participants to rationalize their actions and for future generations to minimize or forget what had actually occurred. When Morrison published photographs of the ledger pages in 2022, the response was immediate and intense. Descendants of enslaved families began searching for their ancestors in the records, finding names that had been lost or distorted through generations of oral transmission. Some discoveries brought closure, answering long-standing family questions about origins and relationships. Others brought fresh grief, revealing the circumstances of ancestors' lives in heartbreaking detail. The ledgers had documented suffering, but they had also preserved names and stories that official records had erased. Chapter 5: The Community's Conspiracy of Silence. The most disturbing aspect of the chapel wedding system wasn't just what happened inside those whitewashed walls, but how entire communities chose to look away. White residents of the surrounding counties knew about Blackwell's chapel circuit. They saw the weddings, heard the stories, observed the consequences. Yet for over a century and a half, that knowledge remained unspoken, buried beneath layers of deliberate forgetting and historical revision. After the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, the question of accountability arose briefly before being quietly shelved. Blackwell had fled Tennessee in 1862, disappearing as Union forces advanced, and he died somewhere in Georgia in 1868 without ever facing justice for his role in the chapel program. But he hadn't acted alone. Plantation owners who had commissioned the weddings, overseers who had enforced them, white citizens who had witnessed them, all remained in the community and all shared a collective interest in rewriting history. By the 1870s, a carefully constructed narrative had taken shape. The chapel weddings, when mentioned at all, were described as voluntary ceremonies conducted to help formerly enslaved people formalize their relationships. Blackwell was remembered in church records as a minister who served plantation communities with dedication and faith. The coercive nature of the program, the young ages of many brides, the breeding ledgers and economic calculations, all of this vanished from official memory. It was a conspiracy not of action, but of silence, an agreement to forget what was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The descendants of enslaved families knew the truth. Sarah's story, and hundreds of others like it, survived through oral tradition, passed down from grandmothers to granddaughters, from great-grandparents to children who listened in quiet rooms. But these stories were dismissed when they surfaced, categorized as exaggeration or bitterness, treated as unreliable compared to written records that had been deliberately sanitized. The community chose to believe sanitized archives over lived testimony, finding it easier to accept comfortable myths than disturbing truths. Local historians writing in the early 20th century contributed to the erasure. Books published about Tennessee plantation history mentioned Blackwell briefly, if at all, characterizing him as a minor religious figure who served rural communities. The chapels he had built were described as simple country churches that provided spiritual comfort during difficult times. Photographs like Sarah's, when they appeared in archives, were catalogued without context, their true meaning obscured by generic descriptions like plantation wedding or domestic servants. The silence was enforced through social pressure and economic power. Descendants of enslaved families who tried to speak publicly about the chapel program faced intimidation and economic retaliation well into the 20th century. Jobs were lost, loans were denied, social standing was threatened. The white families who had profited from slavery remained powerful, and they used that power to control historical narrative. The message was clear: some stories were acceptable to tell, and others needed to remain buried. Even as the civil rights movement brought renewed attention to slavery's legacy, the specific horror of systematic forced reproduction through religious ceremony remained largely hidden. The movement focused on legal discrimination, voting rights, and segregation, immediate injustices that demanded urgent action. Historical atrocities like Blackwell's chapel program seemed too distant, too difficult to prove, too uncomfortable even for those committed to confronting racism's legacy. The silence adapted to new eras, finding new justifications for maintaining itself. The discovery of Blackwell's journals and the breeding ledgers in 2019 shattered that silence, but it also revealed how deep the conspiracy of forgetting had become. Many descendants of the white families involved initially denied the document's authenticity, unable or unwilling to accept that their ancestors had participated in such systematic cruelty. Some claimed the documents had been fabricated, while others argued that the practices documented should be understood within their historical context rather than judged by modern standards. The resistance to truth was reflexive, automatic, a final defense of a narrative that couldn't survive confrontation with evidence. But the evidence was irrefutable, and as Morrison's research gained wider attention, the silence finally began to break. Other researchers started examining archives that had been neglected, finding similar documentation in other southern states. The chapel wedding system, it turned out, hadn't been unique to Tennessee. Variations of it had existed across the plantation South, all hidden by the same conspiracy of silence, all preserved only in documents that communities had hoped would never be found. The breakthrough came when descendants of enslaved families began connecting with researchers, sharing stories and family records that had been preserved privately for generations. These collaborations between academic historians and community knowledge produced a more complete picture than either could have achieved alone. Oral histories provided context and humanity that dry ledgers couldn't capture, while archival documents validated stories that had been dismissed as folklore. Together, they reconstructed a history that communities had spent 150 years trying to forget. The conspiracy of silence had been comprehensive, but it wasn't absolute. Memory had survived, carried forward by people who refused to let their ancestors' suffering be erased. The truth had waited, preserved in hidden documents and whispered stories, until a generation arose that was willing to confront it rather than bury it deeper.